Hi guys, welcome to the Church Split. My name is Will, and you know what we do here. I said that intro 1,000 times. I completely just butchered that. We'll help you escape your church's echo chamber, learn to think biblically, and of course challenge the status quo, which always needs challenging. But first, do all the internet stuff in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe, and do all the stuff with the links below. Too bad this is live, or else I'd restart that. But whatever, man. Sometimes you just don't get the runway strip, and it is what it is. And Nick Quint was asking, do we get the My Pastor Told Me to Be Nice, Will, or Honey Badger Hess? You always get Honey Badger. That's what I am. That's what it is. So anyway, sorry guys, I am late to my stream. So right now it is Christmas season in 2024 at my church, and we are doing this big event called Because Christmas. Now, I'm not going to bother all you guys who are not in Southern Indiana, but I will say it's like a 3-show production, and we are playing like TSO's Carol of the Bells. We're playing all the stuff, and we're pulling out. It's like a complete showstopper the way that is going. And so we have like a bajillion rehearsals this week, and I had that tonight. However, we got out of rehearsal early tonight because things went really, really well for this weekend. Problem is then my wife texts me in the middle of rehearsal that our fridge isn't working. So I ran home, tried to fix it, and I think I might have. And now I ran back here, and that's exactly why I'm late, because I had to try to fix my fridge. And yeah, there's some issues, but that's okay. Everything's broken in this house, and I'm constantly Mr. Fix It right now. So that is just the story of my life. So, but hey, you're not here to hear about my woes, but seriously, I moved into this house and everything's broken, and it's just exhausting. So if you see me getting gray hairs now, that's why. It has nothing to do with my age. Okay, that's just part of it. With that said, guys, go ahead and put any comments and whatnot. Just go ahead and engage in live chat if you want. Any super chats, of course, we'll recognize as soon as I see them, because I switch screens to discuss Mike Winger, all that good stuff. But guys, really liking the video and sharing the video really does help. So I really appreciate anyone who's able to do that. Now, today is part 6 of Lord only knows how many of these we're going to do. We're going to go through his playlist. I'm creating my own playlist based on his playlist, and then maybe he'll create a playlist on my playlist that's based on his playlist, and this can keep going. Just kidding. I really hope that'd just be exhausting. But anyway, so what we're going to do is we're going to jump in finally and respond to like Mike Winger's biblical case now, because he has believed up until this point in the first episode he addressed the history of penal substitutionary atonement, and I responded to that and kind of showed how all the language he kept pulling from was Christus Victor language. That like he'd read a quote that was very like clearly Christus Victor. He's like, see, substitutionary. And there's a couple quotes I'd like had to clarify in there, but there's a couple of quotes, like one from Augustine, that I'm like, okay, if I didn't understand what I understood about the vocabulary, I can see where you're getting that. But other ones were just blatantly Christus Victor, and he was called substitutionary atonement. Then the last one, he tried to show how the Old Testament sacrifices pointed to penal substitutionary atonement. And of course, that didn't actually hold up either, because he actually has the wrong model of the Levitical system in his head, that the Levitical system actually didn't operate the way he thinks it does. So we kind of dealt with that. And then he also tried to pull from the Passover and showed how the Passover lamb was a penal substitute, and that just isn't true. That's not what the text is even remotely getting at. And I've had a few people, of course, because you get the NPCs whenever you respond to like the celebrity types or the big names, the sacred cows, if you will, that no matter what you say, they won't hear it. But I've been accused that I've not made a biblical case yet. But all I'm saying is that the biblical case that he is trying to make, I am reframing them with proper exegesis, or at least what I think is proper exegesis, and then saying that clarifies that, therefore that argument doesn't get off the ground. But regardless, you can't make anyone happy. It's the internet after all. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of jump in here, and okay, I was told people like this view better, so we're going to go with that. And yeah, good Berea says that first one was frustrating. It really was, and I'm going to do my best. The most feedback I got on the first episode I did was not interrupt Mike as much, and that is just really hard when you hear like multiple things where you're like, I want to keep responding. So anyway. Yes, guys, I am in Indiana. Yes, corn. look, guys, like, don't make fun of my state now. Look, I'm a Hoosier now. I used to be a Michigander. Now here I am. So anyway, this is where he has been saying since the beginning of this that he's going to start getting into the biblical case for penal substitutionary atonement. And there's some funny things that he says in here that are actually also blatantly untrue, or it shows the fact that he actually hasn't done his research. So guys, without no further ado, let's go ahead and jump in.
Hey, and welcome to the Tuesday live stream. Here's the problem we're dealing with today. There's influential people, very influential people right now in the church, whether they're actually part of the church or not, I'm not going to comment on, but they're denying and even demonizing central aspects of the meaning of the cross.
Okay, real quick, I wanted to make sure I mention this. He already says this in his own live stream. This particular file of his, whatever stream he did, has a buzz. So just so everyone knows, if you're hearing a buzzing, it's from his video, not mine, but this is me responding. Also, when maybe it's my cynical side coming out, but he goes, there's people in the church, and whether or not they're part of the church, I'm not going to comment on that. Sounds like it's like kind of trying to say that he doesn't think they're part of the church. I could be wrong there, but it seems like, why would you mention that if you didn't think they weren't part of the church? Because again, remember, to him, progressives are the only ones who deny penal substitution. So I think he hasn't, again, I've mentioned this before, he hasn't done his research enough into this. And I know people who are friends with Mike who even was like, yeah, he didn't do enough research because he really opened his mouth and inserted his foot multiple times. So just don't take it from my word for it. Okay, just because the atonement's my hobby horse. And I do want to reiterate before I jump into this any further, I do love Mike. I respect Mike, but you can strongly disagree with people. You can pointedly disagree with them and still love them. I try to practice that on the daily. So people do it with me too. So it's fine. It's the way, if you want to get to the truth of the matter, of any matter, you have to risk offending people, because sometimes you have to say it without beating around the bush in a direct fashion. So that way people can actually see what's being said. And because when everyone's beating around the bush, we've all done that, where we talked around to somebody who was so nice that you didn't really know what they're trying to say at the end, or you had to like listen to them drivel on for 5 minutes before you finally realize that they're trying to make one small point. This is Theological Fight Club. This is where we take our ideas, we throw them out there, and we put them to the test. And sometimes we do a very bad job at it. I've definitely made mistakes in my theology, and I'm sure I'll make plenty more. So just because someone's wrong doesn't mean that they're a bad person. However, I do think that is why using good terminology and not some of the strong language that he uses, especially with somebody who doesn't seem to be as researched on this as he kind of positions himself to be. He kind of makes a few blunders on this, I think, but that's for you to decide. That's my observation. Let me know what you think.
That's like, there's things that the cross means. This is what the cross is about based upon scripture. And they're not only saying that's not true, they're saying it's evil. That's kind of a big deal. And so I'm doing this series right now, getting into the idea that Jesus really did die in my place and he suffered the penalty for my sins. We call this penal substitutionary atonement, one label to give it. But the idea is those elements are in the gospel. They're part of the message of the cross, and we need to hold to these things. And of course, this is under attack. The gospel is always under attack. And here we stand as believers. Our job is to know the word, know the gospel in particular, and to hold to it and to proclaim it.
So to not agree with penal substitutionary atonement is to attack the gospel. You catch that? He equates penal substitution with the gospel. And I don't know who needs to hear this, but your particular atonement theory is not the gospel. The gospel is Jesus Christ risen from the dead and the kingdom of God being at hand. That's really the gospel. Repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, and he will return and judge the living and the dead. Okay, that's the gospel in a nutshell. Your particular mechanics on how all that kind of plays out isn't the gospel. Stop equating them. It drives me nuts whenever I talk atonement stuff. So anyhow, Cosmic said, dang it, Will, you couldn't wait a few seconds. I'm sorry. It's a hard life being me, okay?
So that in the face of those attacks, we're the ones saying, hey, here's the purity and the truth of the gospel. That is our job. That is our goal. And it is probably one of the most important things we do. So it's under attack. But here's the things they'll say. They'll say that penal substitution, or the idea that Jesus died in my place, taking the punishment for my sin, that he suffered the punishment for my sins, that this is cosmic child abuse, or it turns God into a pagan deity who's out for blood. I use quote marks with my fingers here because this is what they say. I'm quoting the guys who say this kind of stuff. Sadly, this is where a lot of the conversation is. And I even hear this stuff entering into pulpits and entering into conversations I have with individuals. As I reach out to pastors and leaders to say, can we talk about penal substitution? I hear them quoting these guys saying, it's cosmic child abuse and that kind of thing. It's a pagan idea.
Okay, so we have 2 complaints already that it's cosmic child abuse. That's what people like on my side of the aisle will use, like the rhetoric that'll be thrown out. It's cosmic child abuse or it's paganism. And I actually have a chapter dedicated to the paganism aspect in my book, actually, here, which Roddy, I know in the live stream is going to make fun of me already for mentioning it. But here's the thing real fast. It's really unfortunate face. I stopped on you there, Mike. I apologize, but whatever. So first off, it is incumbent upon people to prove how these things aren't those things, or to own the parallel that might be there. And so I want you to notice what he does here. What it really is that he doesn't like the framing.
I want to say this. If you've been influenced by these things, you have been bamboozled.
Okay.
My friend, you've been bamboozled. Why do I say that? Because you're not even asking the right questions. You're responding to a caricature. They caricature the doctrine. They make it as ugly as possible. And you're going, I reject that. That's ugly. And what I would say is, hey, you should reject the fact that they make it ugly and say it's not ugly. You're distorting it. But what you should do is stop and ask a whole different question: is it biblical?
No. And yes. No. You can ask. You can go, is it ugly? Well, you see. Now, notice this. This is a false dilemma. Instead of asking, is it palatable? Essentially, is it moral? Is it monstrous? No, don't ask that. Ask instead, is it biblical? No, I can ask both. And I could go, if it's immoral and monstrous, then it can't be biblical, right? Like I can do that. I can use my intellect, my reason, and my intuition, and all these things to go, what does the Bible then really say here? And maybe I've misunderstood it. So Mike has already set up a false dilemma here, and basically and what he does is he sets up the stage, he frames it in such a way where he goes, no, get rid of your intuitions. This is what we call thought terminating cliches, by the way. Get rid of those and just embrace my view. And I'm going to frame my view as the biblical one. So these are kind of like little framing tactics that many people use to sound like they really are meaning well, or what they're saying is true, but that's not necessarily accurate. Also, so let's talk about cosmic child abuse. If God has to pour out his wrath and punish somebody, someone needs to take the punishment for sin, that means anyone can take the blame, apparently, because the holy righteous Messiah can, and he's the Son of God. So God goes, all right, fine. I have to punish someone for sin, or I have to punish sin somehow. You're innocent, but I'll punish you instead. We'll put all that sin and guilt on you, and I will punish you, my son. Then you might not like it being called cosmic child abuse, but one would actually have every right to make that deduction, which is also why I think it's one of those things why a lot of atheists and Jewish people and even Muslims reject actually this messaging. They reject the messaging. I don't want to say they reject Christianity for this reason, but they reject this messaging. They don't resonate with it. In fact, I was actually told recently by some Eastern missionaries to China and Japan and places like that actually the classical view resonates stronger in their culture, and that they actually really struggle with a presentation of penal substitution. So I think that's important to also note that the reason why it resonates with us here in the West is because, one, is part of the cultural milieu from the Reformation. People just assume it. Two, we look at things very much individualistically, and we look at things like a courtroom drama. We look at things legally or forensically. They don't look at it. They're an honor shame culture. So this idea of someone dying to destroy your enemy that you beset against yourself, and then conquering them, and then calling unto you to worship and honor them makes more sense than, well, God had to punish somebody, so he punished his own son. On top of that, people could call it paganism. And I did do a whole breakdown in I think the second to last chapter in here. I'm not gonna look at it right now. I think it's second to last. And here's the issue. Paganism regularly teaches that human sacrifices are necessary to appease angry deities. That is something we see continually throughout pagan worship. Now, here's if there's a parallel there, then I feel like PSA advocates just need to own it and go, yeah. Paganism gets some things right. Sometimes the deity is angry and needs satiation or retribution or payment in order to be satisfied to not punish people. But you usually won't hear that. You'll hear them basically say that, like, God needs to punish somebody. He needs to pour his wrath out. Someone needs to take the punishment for sin. He punishes Jesus. And then, but it's not like paganism, even though they'll use all the same things that are connected to paganism. And this is why I decided to take a dive into this, because usually in the Bible, there are parallels actually between the faith and paganism. So it wouldn't be completely outrageous for the PSA advocate to just go, yeah, there's some parallels. However, what we do see whenever there's parallels in scripture to paganism, it's usually polemical against it or correcting something with it. For example, Baal is known as he who rides in the clouds, or the cloud rider. Well, then you get into different parts of the prophets and it describes, the Almighty God riding in on the clouds. So there's polemics there a little bit. And we see the fact that, like, instead of sacrificing animals on the altar itself, no, we actually don't do that. Instead, we apply the blood instead. And like, we just see differences in the way it's applied. We see like similarities, but then it's not really the similarities that make them separate. It's really the differences, right? And so it is on the PSA advocate to show somehow how PSA is any different than paganism. And the only one that they have to show that, the only difference they'll point to is that, well, in paganism, it's not God giving of himself to do that, which fine, although we have plenty of pagan legends of gods giving themselves up for their creations. In fact, that's why the Aztecs made human sacrifices. They believe those hearts actually fed the gods who did that very thing. But anyway, so anyhow, that's that. I don't know if you're asking me, Bob, Bill, but I call mine the classical view. I hold to Christus Victor, recapitulation, moral example, and form of ransom atonement, but not like God paying off Satan kind of thing. Not that, but freedom at a great cost is the way I would put ransom. But anyway, I don't know if you're talking to me or somebody else in the room. So yeah, it's like Neville said, it is quasi-pagan, and that's, or pagan-esque, like pagan light, diet pagan, less filling, tastes great. So that's what it's like. The parallels are really striking to paganism, which is why people will call it that. And I just think God has made very clear it's not like the pagan gods. So whenever there's any parallels to it, he's usually correcting something, right? Like another good example is Genesis 6 and the flood narrative. We see God correct what the pagan legends. No, it's not that gods are petty and angry at people for making too much noise and just, a bunch of petty gods. No, really what it is that mankind was evil and rampant at the time. And so God was bringing judgment. So anyway, that's the sort of polemics that we should expect to see. And we don't see that in scripture ever in regards to PSA. So we'll go ahead and keep on trucking.
That's the question we're asking right now. What does the Bible teach? Don't tell me you can call it names and you can make fun of it and you can try to make it look ugly. I know you can do that. The question is, what does it actually teach? Is it biblical? That's where I think guys are getting bamboozled. They're getting kind of bullied into, or shamed, I should say, into rejecting something that's actually a wonderful biblical truth. And there is one passage that the anti-PSA individuals always avoid, or they dismiss it after only commenting on one verse or one part of one verse in this whole chapter, in this whole section. This one passage is what they avoid. And that's what we're going to talk about in today's live stream. This is part of a series on penal substitution. And I will put a link to the whole playlist in the video description once I'm done teaching this here, and you can check it all out. That will, I think, by the time it's done, it's going to be very robust, very full fleshed out thing. And I will be listening to criticisms along the way. Maybe I'll make a little video at the end responding just to the criticisms of my own video content. I think that might be a fun way to let everybody hear the whole story, hear both sides, that kind of thing. So is it biblical? That's the question. That's the question. And the question we're trying to answer today is by getting into the major passage, Isaiah 53. This is the crux of the cross, pun intended. And this is where the scripture tells us why Jesus died, what it affected, how it works. This is a major section for teaching us those things.
Agreed, kind of. Now, but real fast. Now, keep in mind, now he's saying that those who deny PSA are people who have been bullied or shamed into that position because of this rhetoric. It can't be because people actually looked into this, researched it, and actually just came to a different conclusion. You've been bamboozled and you've been shamed. This is the sort of thing I like. even though I think like Calvinism is entirely wrong, and I think fundamentalist Baptists have a lot of things wrong, I do think they believe their positions honestly, but I just think that, you know, some of those things that they believe are usually from bad presuppositions. And yeah, maybe bamboozled, but like, it just like the entire framing here. It's not like these people actually, in his mind, have actually done the research. So, Dr. Stephen DeYoung, Father Stephen DeYoung, Father, I should have you on sometime. By the way, I think you and I would actually really have a good conversation. He said, "Bro, Isaiah 53 is where I start, let alone avoid it." And that's exactly it. He always says this, and a lot of PSA people say this. They're like, oh, but people who deny PSA, they avoid Isaiah 53. They hate Isaiah 53. And I'm like, literally, I have an entire section dedicated to it in my own book. All I had to do to find a non-PSA reading was to Google Isaiah 53, not penal substitution. And I found a bunch of resources of people who were talking through the entire text. I don't see people avoiding it at all. So it's kind of like when Calvinists say like, oh yeah, well, non-Calvinists, Arminians and provisionists, they're the chapter they hate the most. The one they always avoid is Romans 9, or, oh, they hate John 6. It's like, no, like, Abasciano like literally has like a multi-volume set on Romans 9, and we still get accused of people not being Calvinists of not ever acknowledging Romans 9. Leighton Flowers' first book on Romans 9, Calvinist, no, they avoid it. Jonathan Williams, same thing. Like, So same thing happens here with PSA. The crowds, like they say this, but it's not true. Like none of us actually avoid it at all. So whatever. Okay. We're gonna keep listening.
It's not the only passage that talks about it. I dealt last week with a whole bunch of other stuff in Leviticus and Exodus. We dealt with penal substitution being, in fact, it'll be important that you've seen that video or you've considered those things, because Isaiah 53, it pulls from the passages we went over last week. So, or 2 weeks ago, I should say. So that's kind of important. But this is basically, in short, how we know what the cross means and how the cross deals with sin and deals with our rebellion against God to restore our relationship with God. That's what this is all about. And for the sake of this study, while there's a lot of good content in Isaiah 53, I'm going to focus on the stuff that relates to, does this teach penal substitution, or does it give us warrant for holding to the kind of elements within that doctrine? That's the idea. Also, I'm going to be getting into the weeds. The debate of penal substitution, that is, it's going to be a little complicated because I'm not just going to preach, here's my opinion. I'm going to bring up objections to my position, because I've been looking long and hard, and it's hard to find them because most of the guys who are against penal substitution, they will never talk about Isaiah 53 except for a verse, maybe one verse, or maybe they'll casually mention stuff, but they never go deep into it. But I had to look really hard to find where they would actually build their case against my case. So I'm going to interact with that. So it's going to be maybe a challenge a little bit for some to follow this video, but it might actually really help people who feel like they've been caught in the weeds, and this might be your way out. At least that's my hope. That's my hope. And I don't pretend I have all the perfect knowledge here. You need to consider what I say thoughtfully. Maybe I've got something off in some sense, but I'm going to try to show my work, try to show you why I think this, why I'm coming to this conclusion, so that hopefully it will just be a blessing to you. So let's talk about Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is one of the servant songs of Isaiah, and already we enter into a debate. Isaiah 53, it says that that the New Testament shows us that this is all about Jesus, right? Some people want to claim it's not even about Jesus, that Isaiah 53 is really about Israel or something like that. That's kind of a separate debate, but I'll just mention very quickly. If you right now on your own, just go Google, servant songs of Isaiah, and you can see them, 42 and 48, 49, whichever chapters and verses they are. And if you just read through the servant songs, you'll notice the same thing I notice, right? That progressively, as you move from one song to the next, it becomes more and more clear that the servant is not, at first it looks like it's Israel. And then as you keep going, it's one individual within Israel who is going to accomplish something where Israel has failed. This is the clear reading of the text. And by the time you hit Isaiah 53, it's well established that the servant is one person within Israel. Isaiah 53 also makes it very clear that it's not Israel. It is rather one person, probably within Israel, who's doing something on behalf of all the people. And the New Testament refutes that idea that it's not about Jesus as well, because Isaiah 53 is the grid, and we'll get into more of this later. It's the grid through which the New Testament interprets the sacrifice of Christ. They're saying this is what Jesus did. This is what it means. It's coming from Isaiah 53.
Hold up. The New Testament actually calls upon a lot of Old Testament images for the sacrifice of Christ and what he did for us. He does not, it doesn't just label it as Isaiah 53. In fact, the way Isaiah 53 is used in the New Testament directly challenges Mike's interpretation of it. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute as well when we get to that section. But the way it's used in the New Testament is actually a direct undercutting of Mike's position. In addition to that, this debate he's discussing on the servant songs. So Isaiah's got 4 servant songs in it, and it's been taken probably as messianic in nature. And he's like, already the debate, is it talking about Israel? Or is it talking about the single individual? And he goes, well, it becomes clearer as the songs go on that they are about an individual. This is actually untrue. And without going through all 4 songs and reading every single verse, I'll summarize this for you, and then you can go ahead and check my work, okay? You can go back, you can go read through the 4 songs yourself, and then you'll see what I mean. Isaiah was talking to Israel. That is clear. His audience has to be taken into account. So it can't just be talking about a single individual to these people who are in rebellion words. The prophet declaring what the Lord's intention is, what Israel's going through, the oppression that Israel's experiencing. So it can't just be about the Messiah, because his audience is to Israel. So Israel has to be the subject here. So, in addition, Old Testament prophets all the time use picture imagery. In other words, if you're reading the prophets and you're taking them hyper literally or hyper woodenly, you're doing it wrong. Here's a great example of that. Israel wasn't known to be seafaring people, for example. So a lot of times when the prophets would refer to the land or the earth, they were actually referring to Israel, and then they looked at water and the sea as chaos and wickedness and evil and tumultuous and all those things. So that would be, sometimes when you see that imagery brought up, that's what it's trying to talk about. It's like, the sea is a foreign, scary place, and here we are safe on land, which also should bring into context of things like Revelation, right? I look to the west and there's a great monster, a beast that came out of the sea. So that imagery is something that's important. So when it starts talking about a singular servant, it's completely within the bounds of possibility that singular servant is the singular servant of Israel, the servants of God, the one nation that serves God, or is supposed to serve God, or is incumbent upon them to serve God, or that is their vocation, so to speak. So it is not incorrect to call Israel the servant here. Actually, here's one of the biggest things that's funny. If you actually make Isaiah 52 and 53 about only Jesus and not about Israel, it actually bastardizes the entire book of Isaiah. Because the book of Isaiah has this entire flow, especially the 4 servant songs. And then if you said they're like, oh yeah, it's clearly Israel is the subject of Isaiah's prophecy. And then you get here, you rip it out and go, well, now that's just messianic. That's nothing to do with Israel. Well, then you really start running into a major problem, because now you're reshaping the entire Old Testament in light of the New Testament. So therefore, the Old Testament context means nothing. You're making an awkward subject shift that's not necessary. There is a way, and my way of viewing Isaiah 53 is a way to do this. There's a way to keep Isaiah 53 simultaneously about Israel and about the Messiah at the same time. And we'll get into that here as we move forward.
Specifically. So Isaiah 53 tells us what the cross is about. And I would say any, quote, theory of the atonement, or, idea about what Jesus did for us, how does it work? Not just that he saves us, but how does that work? That question. Any way you answer that question, if you don't include Isaiah 53 in your answer, you've missed out on some really important data about what Jesus.
I agree. Jordan, I wanted to agree. He's like, he can't write to Israel about the Messiah. No, he can, but the way he's writing about it, he's talking Israel is the entire subject. And even though it's messianic in nature, but what he's doing is he's creating a parallel of what Israel is doing for the nations here, and then what the Messiah is going to do for the nations here. It's kind of one of those double fulfilling prophecies in my view. And I think that's actually how a lot of the prophecies work in the Old Testament. Like we see God declaring all these different things. And then we see in the New Testament that those things are fulfilled in Christ, but they're also fulfilled back then with these guys. Like they were directly relevant to them. And then God pulls from that from Messiah. So he can, and I think it is messianic. People still believe it's messianic, and so do Jews. But actually, one of the big reasons why Jews reject Christianity is because they bring up penal substitutionary atonement and they point to Isaiah 53. And Jews who read Hebrew are like, bro, that's not what Isaiah 53 is about at all. So it's just anyway. So thank you for asking that. Good question. So hopefully that cleared that up.
Jesus did for us. You're just ignoring a central teaching. So that being said, let's start Isaiah 53. We're going to start in Isaiah 52. And the reason why you're like, 52, because really the section is Isaiah 52, verse 13, all the way through Isaiah 53, the end of the chapter, verse 12. I'm just going to say Isaiah 53 as shorthand for Isaiah 52, 13 to 53, 12, because it's just easier. So now you know. Isaiah 52, 13, it's all one section, okay? I'm not cherry picking something out of the text. This is a servant song, we call it. It's all one big section, and it should all be read together. It should all be read in context if we're going to understand it well. Yep. And it says here in verse 13, behold my servant. That's where we get the my servant passage here. Understanding. Hold on. That was the Septuagint. I'm going to come back to the Septuagint in a minute. First, let's go to Isaiah 52, 13. We'll start with the ESV. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many as were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance and his form beyond that of the children of men. So he's beat up, he's marred, he's all that. It goes on in verse 15 and tells us, so shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand.
Okay, yeah, so this is great. Again, I don't disagree with the Bible. Isaiah 52, so the idea of sprinkling, for example, it says right there in verse 15, so shall he sprinkle. Sprinkle means, is another way to like designate covenant people. You sprinkle blood, or you sprinkle it over the mercy seat. It wasn't about a penal substitute. So I just make sure we're clear here. That was a ritual that was done. Now, the reason why this is about Israel is because if you see a bunch of nations, all the nations, so Israel's been through a lot at this point in Isaiah's prophecy, a lot of oppression, and yet they are supposed to be the light, and they are the light to the many nations. And it says that throughout the process that the kings are astonished at Israel, essentially, because despite all this, their suffering, they still remain faithful. They bear the sins of others upon themselves and continue on serving the Lord, and then that they are healed. But then also, this servant who is Israel is also the Messiah, because it's not just the servant people, but it is also about the servant king. So when you understand this is actually, that's why else would the nations surrounding Israel at this point shut their mouths? If it wasn't for that, it's about Israel enduring their persecution and the foreign kings thinking that this was punishment from some sort of God or divine justice against Israel, but really they're being oppressed by evildoers, and God is actually going to bear them up and heal them and restore them, and he's going to do that through the Messiah. That's like the double messianic prophecy here.
That which has not been told them they see, that which they have not heard they understand. This, okay, there's a lot here, but I'm focusing on the PSA kind of elements, penal substitutionary atonement. And there's one in particular that stands out, and it's this word sprinkle. It's this word sprinkle. This is kind of a big deal. That word sprinkle, in the context of consistently and constantly in the Old Testament, that word is used to refer to sprinkling, like when you sprinkle water or oil or blood on something. In the Levitical law and in relation to sacrifices, and we'll see Isaiah 53 is all about the Levitical law and sacrifices. It's all connected. In relation specifically to the law and sacrifices, the term sprinkle is used to refer to when they would say sacrifice an animal and take the blood and sprinkle it on the altar, sprinkle it on the tent, sprinkle it over here, sprinkle it over there. And it was meant to be covering the sins or dealing with the sins of the people.
Notice that the blood covers the sin. Isn't that what we've been saying? I talked about the kippah and kippur in our last stream pretty extensively. Go back there to check it out. But I talked about Leviticus here and how the blood represents life, cleansing, death. It doesn't represent like punishment. It represents covenant, life pledged to another, because they believe blood equaled life. So yeah, as I mentioned, sprinkling is these things. Mike, this is true, but the problem is that your presupposition that these things also must be preloaded with penal substitution was actually not what the historical context was. It's not what the historians believe. It's not what the language talked about. It's not what the focus was. And again, this is another reason why Christian theology has a hard time reaching Jewish people for Jesus, because we kind of try to co-opt their systems that they know about, that they read in Hebrew, that they actually understand the symbology, because a lot of the rabbis have written on it, and we have ignored it. And we also have ignored a lot of the early church fathers who also echoed this. And it's funny because like a lot of Christians tend to be like Zionists, right? They're like really big and like supporting Israel and doing all those things. Yet so many of them seem to not understand why their Christian message doesn't resonate with Jewish people, even though they support Israel. It's because of things like this. It's because of you're misunderstanding their own Levitical theology. And I wouldn't be able to take it seriously if I knew it very well and someone was trying to reach me and say, oh, no, ours is the true one. It'd be like when a Jehovah's Witness tries to tell you what it really means for Jesus to be a God, right? As opposed to the God. You know, it's like, you're like, that's not what that means, and you're confused. Like, so I honestly think that's one of the main reasons why we don't see a lot more Jews coming to the faith, is because we actually seem to misunderstand these things, and it just sounds like foreign to them.
So the significance of this, if we're interpreting it right, sprinkle is reference to a sacrificial thing, and we'll see later in Isaiah 53, we have a lot of support for this. Then this sprinkling of the suffering servant of Jesus is going to sprinkle not just Israel, but many nations. It's going to be a atoning thing for lots of nations around. Now, there's, of course, a huge debate on this issue, because they will say that the sprinkle of verse 15 is actually translated wrong. And footnotes will even say, for instance, we have a footnote here in the ESV that says, or startle. It could be startle instead of sprinkle. And there's a big debate on this. And I definitely lean strongly towards thinking sprinkle is correct, and most translations do as well. But this is where the debate begins. They'll say sprinkle means startle, Mike, and in the Septuagint, and you'll need to know what the Septuagint is for today's study if you don't already. I'll explain in a second. But in the Septuagint, it actually says startle or astonish, and therefore it's just a misinterpretation. Jesus isn't going to sprinkle many nations like a sacrifice. He's going to shock them. They're going to be, I can't believe what he went through. Wow, look at that. Well, that's true in and of itself, but is that what it really says? We're going to get into the Septuagint here. So the Septuagint is an ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament.
I want to just quickly mention this. Yeah, Septuagint, ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew. Okay. Again, it can be astonished. That's also a viable translation, by the way. Many scholars have talked about this. It could also be sprinkle. My theology isn't directly impacted much by either one, and so I think the debate is kind of unnecessary. Sprinkling many nations. Well, if he expands the covenant to Gentile nations, and sprinkling is simply cleansing or life pledged for life, or life covering the sin stain of death, then it doesn't really matter. That doesn't teach penal substitution. That just teaches that there's some sort of sprinkling going on. So again, the reason why I point this out a lot is because I want you to see where the presupposition lies, and I want people to see where he's preloading it as opposed to demonstrating it. Where I'm trying to tell you that historians have talked about this. The sacrifice, killing the animal, wasn't even the focus of the sacrifices. Like, that was the point. It's actually something that's very glossed over in all the literature. It's quickly like, yep, killed. And then we took the blood, and the focus is a lot more on the blood. Take the blood, you come here, you smear it here, you smear it there, you dump the rest there, and it really focuses on that. Then talks about how life is actually in the blood, and that death is sin is death, and that life is what Christ gives us, and that is through his blood, which is life again. And so we see those connections. So again, I could just say these are the connections, and I don't see punishment in there, that we're punishing another person or being. And in fact, N.T. Wright, Michael Bird, Dr. Heiser, all these people have all pointed this out. Blood, the killing was just a means to an ends to get the blood to do the ritual, and you killed the creature because you're sharing a meal with your creator, and it's the best, most beautiful gift you can give him because you love him that much to give him the greatest thing you have, of the top of all the stuff you own. So it's just very different than we're got to punish this perfectly good creature. Why? Well, we're just going to punish it because we're bad. But why does it get punished anyway? Ezekiel 18 laughs at you. All right, moving forward.
It was produced, the Isaiah Greek translation was produced from Hebrew to Greek, probably 200 years before Jesus, probably about that time. Now, this is really old, the Septuagint. And so the Septuagint of Isaiah 53 reads in several important places very differently from the Hebrew that we have in either the Masoretic text or the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ancient Hebrew copies that we have of Isaiah 53. It reads very different. One of the differences is it says startle instead of sprinkle. I'll get later into the idea that the Septuagint is probably not a reliable translation of Isaiah 53. That'll come much later because I want to put it where I feel like it'll fit best in this whole deal.
That's a bold statement. So the Septuagint's not a reliable translation of Isaiah 53. What were the disciples and the apostles using and their disciple? Like, wow. All right. Real quick, In Truth by Grace says, no, Jews do not come to Jesus because some Christians don't understand. Jews do not come to Jesus because the Jews reject Jesus. Well, I mean, yeah, they reject Jesus. That's why they don't accept Jesus. But why do they reject Jesus? That's what I'm getting at. Now, some of them might just reject it outright because they're hostile for Christianity, whatever, hearts are hardened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them, though, and many unbelievers, reject it because what's been presented to them is bad. It's not well done. I know many people who were like atheists for a long time, but they were never given good reasons to believe. And every Christian they talked to stumped them. And then after having a sit-down conversation with myself or Braxton Hunter or somebody who actually knows what they're talking about to some degree or other, suddenly the person's like, oh, that makes actually a lot of sense. And then they repent and believe. Okay. This happened even recently with someone I know I had the privilege of baptizing. So yeah, some people reject Jesus, but the question is why? Is it because their hearts are hardened against him? Is it because they don't think it's ever possible and they just like, nope, I will not accept that? Or is it because maybe Christians are sometimes bad at presenting our beliefs and we got to do better at making a case. We got to do better at persuading one another. We have to do better at making a defense for our faith and all those things. Like we got to get better at the discipline, loving the Lord our God with our heart, soul, and mind. You got to use our brains. All right, cool. So I hope that clarifies that and cleans that up. All right, we'll keep trucking.
But let me give you a case offered by John Golden Gay and David Payne. These two authors offer their case for why it should be translated as sprinkle, not as startle. This is in their work, A Critical and Exegetical Commentary on Isaiah 40 through 55, Volume 2, okay, page 294 and 295. And they note a few things. They note that other ancient translations also translate it as sprinkle. Specifically, the Greek versions of Aquila and Theodotion, they render it sprinkle, not astonish. The Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, renders it as sprinkle. And in the author's judgment, they're like, hey, these guys aren't being influenced by theological concerns. They're just translating. The Peshitta,
I never buy that, by the way, when, they're not influenced by theological concerns. Dude, the amount of Bible translations I've seen with clear theological biases, we'll see. But again, not that it really matters to me because I fully can accept sprinkle. I have no problem accepting sprinkle because that's a clear reference to Levitical offerings, and Levitical offerings had nothing to do with penal substitutionary atonement, as have been pointed out by many, many, many historians.
Ancient translation of the work itself also renders it as purify. And so we have multiple translations that affirm this. They also go on to say, hey, the word itself in Hebrew really should be sprinkled. That's how it is handled throughout the rest of the text of the Old Testament. It's always as a sprinkle term. And so they conclude the following. These renderings suggest that the versions were able to work out that this is a distinctive usage of the verb without the usual preposition. Why am I quoting all that? Because I realize I have a mixed audience. Some of you guys, I'm introducing you to these topics, and some of you, you're deeply introduced to these topics, and you're just looking for someone to help you out of the weeds, so to speak. So I'm going to kind of cover both. I'm going to give you sort of some deep stuff and some more shallow stuff to kind of hopefully help everybody. But the bottom line is that the Septuagint seems like it's drawing from Aramaic as opposed to Hebrew to justify their translation. Other translations don't agree with the Septuagint, and I'll say this: the Septuagint is suspect in Isaiah 53 in particular for reasons I'll get to later in this video.
Again, I'm not going to take Mike's word that the Septuagint is unreliable, because if it's unreliable in Isaiah 53, then it was unreliable when Matthew wrote from it. The Gospels quote the Septuagint often, and Matthew directly references Isaiah 53. So this is one of those things where, are you just trying to knock something? Like, I don't want to like play psychoanalysis here, but it's like my thought process is, are you just trying to knock down the Septuagint's rendering of this because you have a theological bias that it directly contradicts. Now you can just say, I prefer the majority text, so to speak. Like I prefer this textual rendering than that textual rendering. But saying it's just unreliable is a very bold statement, considering the fact that he is an inerrantist. He takes that very seriously, and as he should. I'm an inerrantist myself. So, but it's one of those things where do you realize that you're sawing off the branch on which you sit on when you say these sorts of statements? I believe the Septuagint is perfectly reliable, is perfectly fine, and if it's good enough for the apostles, it's good enough for me. And yes, there are multiple Septuagints as well. So.
Okay, let's move on. So we already have some sacrificial terminology that's right there. If I'm wrong, it's not going to kill my case because my case doesn't depend on that. That's like a cherry on top. Okay, Isaiah 53 verse 1. It says, "But who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not." Okay, now it's getting into the important stuff for today's case here. Verse 4, "Surely he's borne our griefs and carried our sorrows."
Oh, that's sly. Okay. All right. Okay. By the way, guys, I don't watch this full video all the way through in a while. So I don't know if he actually gets there. So let's just rewind for a minute. Look what's on the screen. So remember, these nations are looking at this servant who is, in Isaiah's case here, Israel, but also the Messiah. Okay. And they're all looking and they're going, they shut their mouths at him because they are astonished or sprinkled by the blood, whatever. And then the prophet goes, "Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root of the dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him." Okay, pretty straightforward. "He was despised and rejected by men." Okay,
look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Okay, now it's getting into the important stuff for today's case here. Verse 4, "Surely he's borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted."
So notice this. He describes the servant. "Surely has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken." Does that sound like he's saying that all these things are part of the same thought? Like, yeah, here's a description of him, here's a description of him, and yet still continue the description of him? No. That yet is important because it's actually separated the thought and pointing to it. Okay, so he's all these things, yet what? We esteemed him stricken by God. Or in other translations will say we considered him to be stricken by God. So in other words, the nations are looking at Israel, that all the stuff that they're suffering, must be divine punishment upon them. But even though this happened to Messiah and to Israel, they're both punished or oppressed by evildoers. They considered it to be an act of God that they deserved it. Actually, oddly enough, it sounds like the bad guys in this situation are those who are kind of believing PSA. Now, you don't have to get mad at me about that, but that does be what it be. Like, when all this stuff is happening, we considered him just to be under divine punishment. And that's not what it was at all. And he clarifies because he did this to restore them, not put them through this, put the servant through this to punish the servant. The people, the onlookers, have it wrong. That's the whole point. Justice is on its head. They're blaming God for something God's not involved in, and yet we esteemed him stricken by God. So I doubt he really gets into that much, but let's see.
Now let me pause right here and say griefs and sorrows and carrying these things, for in the context of Isaiah, this is where we need to recognize the book has a context. Isaiah is written to a people who are suffering under God's judgment or punishment for their sins. They're grieved and they're full of sorrow, and they need to be healed, but yet and they need peace, but they don't have it because God says there's no peace for the wicked. Throughout Isaiah, they're afflicted, they're just being wrecked. And it's not just because they're oppressed by bad guys. They are oppressed by bad guys, but the reason is because of their sin. And so in context of Isaiah 53, or in context of Isaiah chapter 53, verse 4, him bearing our griefs, these griefs are the result of God's punishment on their sin, and this man is bearing them. That's the
Is that what it says? No, he has borne our griefs. So he says that's because of their sin. That's actually not what's like right now. It's actually Israel being just straight up oppressed. Like Babylon has just wrecked them. Now, is it true that these empires that took over them or initially because of their sin? Yes. But now it's like people crying out to be delivered. Like this is them doing repentant stuff. And it's like he has borne our griefs. He carried our sorrows. So in other words, he came alongside us and aided us. Yet we esteemed him stricken by God, smitten by God, and afflicted. He did all these wonderful, loving things for us, and yet we blamed God for killing him. Does this sound like the bad guys in this situation agree with PSA? Because it sounds like it to me. The problem continues.
Context of the chapter in the whole book and in the whole Old Testament. But then they go on and they say, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. And this is going to be an important verse to debate on, along with verse 5. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his...
Okay, we're going to keep going down. But it's funny because I just want to point out Father Stephen DeYoung in the comments says, never go full Job's friends, because that's what Job's friends did. And here's what's funny about that. I actually mentioned that in my book. I was like, it actually reminds me of this. So great minds think alike and all that.
His wounds, we are healed. Now, here's where this is, most of the time they don't deal with Isaiah 53, the anti-penal substitution guys. They just ignore it. In my experience, I'm not saying, I can't speak for everybody. I'm saying the guys I've encountered, the people I've been able to access, and I've looked and looked and looked. Most of them, they don't deal with Isaiah 53, but they always...
Must not have looked very far. I'm just saying.
If they do deal with it, they always hook on verse 4 and make this almost their whole case. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Here's what they want to say. We thought Jesus was being punished, but he wasn't being punished. That's what verse 4 is saying. It wasn't God who did it. We punished Jesus. We hurt him, but it wasn't from God. And here's where we're going to encounter this over and over again with those who deny penal substitution. I can agree oftentimes with what they affirm, but I can't agree with what they deny. I will affirm we attacked Christ. We sought to, we as a people sought to punish him. But I can't affirm what they deny. They deny it wasn't God. God didn't do it. God didn't have this in mind. It wasn't some sort of plan of God's in that sense of directly causing these things. And there I have to deny that. And that's going to be the case. Constantly, they're giving us these false dilemmas. And we're saying that's not.
No, Mr. Winger, you're the one giving us a false dilemma. You already did that at the beginning of this. Is it biblical or is it just not jive with you? You're the one giving the false dilemmas. Also, yes, verse 4 is extremely important because it is a turning point in the narrative. If you ignore that turning point in a narrative, like, for example, I read when I was recovering with my broken leg, I read a trilogy, the Red Rising trilogy, fantastic sci-fi. But Pierce Brown, who wrote that series, courtesy of my friend Paul Hoving, by the way, he gave it to me, got me hooked on it. His writing is very quick and direct. And one sentence will have this crazy plot changing event happen. It'll be like the stuff's happening, bam, one sentence, and then just the fallout after that. And it just happens so suddenly, but it's so good that, and it makes sense when it happens, but you're just like, oh my gosh. But if I miss that one sentence, if you are one of those skimming readers and you miss that one sentence, you're going to be lost in the plot. So yeah, it's kind of important for us to focus in on a part of a verse that could be flipping the narrative one way or the other. On top of that, is it a sin to do the will of God? Because what you're saying is that it's sinful for people to have attacked him, but God also wanted that to happen and willed for that to happen and desired for that to happen. That was his ultimate pinnacle plan, was for them to do this. This is the problem of penal substitution, because penal substitution, well, one of the many problems, I should say. Penal substitution demands that God has to have his retribution. So he had to send Jesus in order to kill him. That had to happen. He had to be able to kill Jesus and put the sins on him. But also, we know historically that the crucifixion of Jesus was unjust and that Pontius Pilate was corrupt, and so were the people. So we want to, on one hand, say that the people were wrong to do it. But on the other hand, we say that, oh man, it was God's will to do it, and it was the right thing to do because God wanted it done. But those are two juxtapositions to each other. If you get rid of PSA, the whole situation works out just fine. God wants to redeem his people, and he knows if he sends a Messiah that people will kill him. But he also knows that if they kill him, he will get to send his son to death to resurrect and destroy the power of Satan, which is death. Basically, God uses his foreknowledge and his all infinite wisdom to undo everything the enemy wanted to do through his greed and his basically being overly zealous to kill Jesus. So, but without the wrath component, that actually makes sense. But once you add the wrath component and him needing retribution and payment, once you add that aspect to it, it then turns into, well, God orchestrated the whole thing and wanted them to kill Jesus, but then still blames the people, which is, by the way, perfectly fine if you're a Calvinist. It is not perfectly fine if you're a non-Calvinist, because Calvinists say all the time that people just, God predestined all the things that happen, people do it willingly. And even though he predestined for it to happen and decreed it for it to happen, that doesn't absolve us of responsibility. How that shakes out, we don't know. We punt to mystery, as Grudem did in his own book. But, sorry, lost my train of thought. But in PSA, you have that same conundrum, but it seems like nobody wants to actually talk about that on the PSA side.
That's not the way it is. So this is actually ends up being kind of an anachronism, and you'll hear this constantly, guys. You need to know this if you're going to enter this debate. We thought he was stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted, right? But he was pierced for our transgression. So it wasn't anything Jesus did. It was all us. It was our sin that hurt him. He didn't get punished. That is just, this is anachronism. They're reading into verse 4, penal substitutionary atonement. And then verse 5 is the rejection of penal substitutionary atonement, but that's not what verse 4 and 5 are saying when you look at them in context. When you take away the theological baggage that some people are bringing to the passage, it's simply the crowd. The crowd's not saying he was punished for our sins to bring us forgiveness. Oh no, we thought he was punished to bring us forgiveness, verse 4. But he was pierced for our transgressions. That's the anachronism. It just says we thought he was stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted, meaning we thought Jesus deserved it. We thought he earned it. We thought he was getting what he deserved. And this is what the people of Israel were thinking when Christ was on the cross. See, this proves that he's a bad guy. This proves that God rejects him. They thought he was being punished for their own sins. That's the error. The text goes on to affirm why he was actually punished, or why he suffered, I should say. I won't snick.
No, the people didn't. What? Yeah, he was a sin, stricken by God and afflicted. And I want to make sure I'm understanding him properly.
He's a bad guy. This proves that God rejects him. They thought he was being punished for their own sins. That's the error. The text goes on to affirm why.
They thought he was being punished for their own sins? That's what PSA teaches, right? Okay.
Why he was actually punished, or why he suffered, I should say. I won't slip the word punish in there just yet. They say he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And then it just makes it even more clear. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. Chastisement that brought us peace. Now, here's where I did some major homework on the word chastisement. Did you know chastisement is in the prophets of the Old Testament? It's always affliction from God. It's not affliction from man. And that's what the anti-PSA crowd wants to say. We sinned against him. That's how he was pierced for our transgressions. We hurt him. It's just saying we sinned against him. But it's not saying that, right? It's saying that there was a chastening upon him. And it was the chastening that brought us peace. Remember Israel, they get no peace for the wicked. Jesus, he suffers for them. Now they can have peace. Why? Because the punishment or the chastening they deserved, it went on Christ. That's what this passage seems to be clearly teaching. When I say chastening is in the prophets, always affliction from God, let me give you a list of examples. You might want to write these down. Isaiah 26, verse 16. That's it used in Isaiah. This passage, 53:5. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 30. Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 3. Jeremiah 7:28. Jeremiah 10:8. Jeremiah 17:23. 30, verse 14. 32, verse 33. 35, verse 13. Ezekiel 5:15. Hosea 5:2. Zephaniah 3:2. Zephaniah 3:7. That's every occurrence of the word in the prophets. Always in the context of God bringing suffering upon people as a result of their sin. and it says what the chastisement that brought us peace was upon him. That is clearly a substitutionary element that's happening there, and an element of punishment in the passage.
First off, just because Jesus would be chastised isn't clearly substitutionary. This is where he just like grants himself things again, where he just goes, it's clearly this, and it's just like a random assertion. You might be able to get punishment out of that, but substitution, nah. But as thank you, Ernie, very much here. Ernie Lawrence Jr. says Jesus was being punished for Jesus's sin is what the Jews were thinking as they cried out, crucify him. Exactly. So this whole Mike's interpretation of that was bizarre. That's why I'd rewind it. I'm like, am I understanding that properly? No, clearly they were like, we're punishing him. He deserves that punishment. We esteemed him stricken by God and afflicted. But then it goes on. Then he goes, and then let's see. There's another in here. And then in truth by grace says chastisement is not a punishment ever. It is instruction. Yeah. And so here's what I also wanted to mention here. And Mike so far hasn't gotten there. So hold on. I want to see if he's going to move on to verse 6 before I mention it.
Now, some would object to this and they'd say, but Mike, God can't use wicked men to punish, these are evil men. They're wrong for doing this to Christ. So God wouldn't be using them to punish Christ. That'd be unjust. But God uses wicked people to judge people all the time.
But what is he judging Jesus for? That's the problem here. Like, sorry, I know I have some people who are more like less intense than me, but I'm really passionate about this. But this is one of those things where you just want to be like, okay, yeah, God uses unjust people all the time to bring judgment upon other wicked people. Like, that's pretty normal. Where he's just like, all right, well, I'll remove my blessing of protection and fine, let wicked people do what wicked people want to do. But what did Jesus do to deserve the punishment? Ezekiel 18 says the sins of the father cannot be visited on the son, and the son's sins cannot be visited upon the father. The soul who sins shall die. What did Jesus do? Nothing. So again, back to what I was just talking about, the will of God doesn't quite follow. However, I do want to mention verse 5 here. I don't know if he's going to get to it right here, but I sure will. It says, but he was pierced for our transgressions. Now, doing something for somebody does not equate to doing it in their place. I can die for someone without dying as their substitute, right? I can, if they are going to fall off the cliff, I throw myself out and push them back to land, but I fly off the cliff when I do so. I died for them, but it doesn't mean I died in a penal substitutionary way. I just died on their behalf, so to speak. I died so that they might live. So he was pierced for our transgressions, for them. He did it for them. So that way they could what? Be healed, apparently, and bring us peace. He was crushed for our iniquities. And here's what's funny. I'm surprised he hasn't so far hung up on this, because a lot of people like to bring up crushed. Crushed in the Hebrew means either two things. First one means to kill, which is what most PSA people go with. He was killed for our iniquities. See right there, he was punished for it. But again, being killed for your iniquities is not the same thing as being done in your place. If God simply wanted Jesus to die so that he might resurrect to destroy death and bring people and usher them into the new life and new covenant, then yes, God wanted him to be killed. Or the second definition of crushed here can mean something like humbled, like you were crushed under it, depressed. So he was humbled for our iniquities. And this would go right in line with something like Philippians 2, which is where he poured himself out and became like one of us. And he set aside the glory of God, right? And to become the incarnate Christ. Either way, the word crushed there could mean humbled or it could mean killed. I think it means humbled in this area. I don't have a problem with the sprinkle earlier, and I'll actually just be like, I think that's probably correct. But here I'm like, no, I think actually it's trying to say like humbled, because that's kind of the whole point. That's kind of stricken, smitten, afflicted, depressed, humbled. Like it's trying to like not give you, we murdered him like imagery as much as it's trying to show how humiliated he was. So anyway, and upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And as mentioned here, it's not punishment, it's instruction. It's the instruction upon him that brought us peace. Or by the way, he says, because all these other prophets always use it as God's chastisement. Okay, I don't care how other prophets use it. I'm asking how is Isaiah 53 using it? And if he started in verse 4 saying, "Yet we esteemed him stricken by God, but he was these things," and there's the chastisement that brought us peace. Whose chastisement? It doesn't say. But I can say, based on the context of, well, he was all these great things, yet we esteemed him and considered him to be stricken by God and afflicted, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He did it for our sins, right? He was humiliated for our iniquities and our sins. And upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. Sounds like a poetic way of saying the beatings we gave this guy or the humiliation we may have given this guy is what brought us peace. So ironically, when we brought this guy pain and chaos, he returned to us healing and life. That seems to be the message here. Again, because what did it say at the end of chapter 52? That the kings of the nations are and they are astonished. They'll shut their mouths. And by the way, astonished fits well with that idea of shutting their mouths, right? They're shocked, so they shut their mouths. But either way, if sprinkled, then shut their mouths. It doesn't matter. They shut their mouths because they're clearly aghast at what was happening. What were they aghast at? What was so shocking to them? Well, the fact that the very people the nation that they were persecuting is very much the nation that was going to bring them healing through the Messiah. So therefore, and as they punish the Messiah, he's going to bring them healing because he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It's the healing that he brings them. Powerful messaging here.
In the Old Testament, the Moabites he uses to judge the Israelites, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and then he uses them to judge each other, and he calls them bad guys all over the place. God uses humans for his purposes, for his glorious, just purposes, even when those people are unjust. And that's consistent in the Old Testament. In Isaiah 53, verse 10, we have a relevant passage because here's the thing. They want to say, let me find the verse here. Okay, he was crushed for our iniquities. There it is. Okay. This is kind of like a key point I'll bring up, and I know this stuff gets a little confusing, so forgive me. But guys like Brian Zond, or I think Brooksy Cavey, I'm pretty sure I've heard him support this as well. And I point these guys out because they're prominent here on YouTube, and that's where a lot of you guys are watching. And other guys who want to come against this. I think Greg Boyd says the same thing. They say Jesus was crushed for our iniquities in the sense that our iniquities crushed him. Our iniquities did the crushing, and then they say, therefore, it wasn't God. And remember how you can affirm half of what they say, but you can't affirm the other half. That's the half you can't affirm. Oh, it wasn't from God. God didn't want that to happen. God didn't do it. God wasn't involved. That's like a mantra with the people who are against penal substitution.
I'm sorry, what did the Nicene Creed say? That he suffered under God? No, under Pontius Pilate. Oops.
But keep in mind that word crushed is used one more time, and that's in Isaiah 53, verse 10. So let's zoom down there. We'll come back up in a minute. Where it says it was the will of the Lord to crush him, and he has put him to grief. This is the agency. This is the one doing the crushing. It was human involvement, but yet ultimately you zoom out and you see the sovereignty of God. It was God's will, and he crushed, and it's the same Hebrew word, right? He was crushed by our iniquities. Well, now we can go and say, well, how does that work? Because it was God's will to crush him, because God has put him to grief. So this is an active. God is active in the crushing, in the death of Christ, in the sacrifice of Christ. He is taking an active role. That's the idea.
Okay, so again, he doesn't seem to be actually getting into how the idiomatic use of the word crush in Hebrew is. I want to say, was it dakah? Anyway, I guess it doesn't matter what the actual word is. You look it up. But real quick, Father Stephen DeYoung says that's because the prophets are arguing that Israel's afflictions are from God. That doesn't mean anything about who is afflicting the servant if it isn't Israel. Bingo. So I just want to point that out. I always like his commentary. He does a really great job at adding more fun things in here. There was another one, but wow, you guys got busy. Well, whatever. It's lost now. We're going to keep moving. But right here, again, he's not really getting into what crush means here. Yeah, it was the will of God, the Lord to crush him. Now, right here, people are like, see, it was to kill him or to humble him. He has put him to grief. And if you look at what the early church and how they all interpreted this, the idea of being put to grief was because he took on the form of man. That was took on mortality and was able to die, which was the penalty, or in other words, the result of sin, not necessarily the punishment directly from God. Okay, because Irenaeus and others thought death was also mercy. So I just want you guys to see where the preloaded thing is here, because to kill doesn't mean penal substitution. It seems like a lot of PSA advocates seem to confuse the fact that just because you show that God may have wanted Jesus to die, But the question is why? What was the purpose of that death? What was it because he wanted retribution? Or was it because he had a greater purpose to destroy death and Satan's domain and all those things? They think that's showing the fact that our sins were involved. Somehow it teaches penal substitution. It doesn't. That's just because there's an exchange. It doesn't prove penal substitution. None of those things exclusively, because there's 1,000 ways that all those different things could work mechanically to get you there. So anyway, hope that helps.
Yeah, we're getting. Let's see. This will become more clear as we keep progressing through Isaiah 53. It'll just get more obvious as we go, because I'm just building the case step by step. I'm not hanging my whole case on any one of these verses. And I'll answer objections about the Septuagint in a little bit for those who are chomping at the bit thinking, what about? I'll get there. Okay, so let's talk about this word pierced. He was pierced for our transgressions. Pierced for our transgressions. Now, transgressions are, according to Dr. Michael Brown, he's a Semitic scholar, and he's a language expert on this stuff, and he says transgressions are willful rebellious acts. They're willful rebellious acts. So these are like next level sins. All sin is here in this giant category of sin, but transgressions like within that sin category, and it's even worse than some other sins because willful rebellious act. And then we get into one of our first debates, and this has to do with was Jesus pierced for our transgressions, or was he pierced because of our transgressions? And I'm going to save you. I mean, you could literally spend your whole day studying for hours on just this one little question. I'm going to try and save you a lot of that. The Hebrew word is men. The Hebrew is men, and that gives us the for our, or because of, and that's the debate. Which one is it? The detractors, the anti-PSA crowd, they're typically going to say that word men, it means because of, it doesn't mean for. And I read several articles where they said this sort of thing. It means because of, it doesn't mean for, and so it should have said bay, if a different word bay instead of men, if they wanted to say that Jesus died for our sins. And then once they've said it's because of, not for, they go, well, if it's because of our sins, then Jesus isn't sacrificially dying in our place to pay the price for our sin or something like that. No. We're sinning against him. Like he died because we sinned against him. And then it becomes sort of this watered down. Even when I say it out loud, I honestly think, how do they sustain like seriousness when they're looking at the text like this? It just doesn't give them warrant. Even if they're right, even if it means because of, that doesn't rule out penal substitutionary atonement, because penal substitution holds that Jesus died because of our sins.
I don't know how people can read Isaiah 53 and take it seriously from a penal substitutionary angle. See, I can do it too. It doesn't actually make an argument, but it makes for a fun rhetorical plays, which I'm okay with, by the way. I'm perfectly fine with rhetorical jabs that are backed up. However, again, it's just because he's got his lenses on. That's why. I mean, it's clear that, but he was pierced for our transgressions. Okay, it was done for them. Like, he was crushed for iniquities. Like, these things are not unique to PSA. And you should probably understand how these are applied. And yes, the word for is because. You can use that pretty much interchangeably. And the reason why a lot of anti-PSA people will say because instead of for is because they know that you have for in your brain is preloaded in your brain as for equals in place of, for equals in place of. So we'll say, hold on, let me read it to you with the other way that Hebrew word is used. But he was pierced because of our transgressions. Oh, for, because, see how they're also, for is also like doing something for something. It can also be doing something because of something, or for in their place, or for to do them favor. But that word for in Hebrew is also because. So, and we use it the same way in English. So anyway, when you do that, the reason why we'll point that out is just to show the fact that, well, now you see how that works, because if he was pierced because of our transgressions, that can change it a little bit clearer to showing how it was our sin that caused an issue. And as he's like, well, PSA, we believe that too. Yeah, but we actively deny the penal substitutionary part. So we're trying to show how for and because can also not get you penal substitutionary language. And I don't think it is there.
Because of is just way too vague for them to get what they want to get out of it. It's just way too vague. And the word itself isn't so cut and dry. Min, the word is used over 7,000 times in the Old Testament. It has a huge variety of uses. You can't say it means because of and not for. Sometimes it means because of, sometimes it means for. Sometimes it has some meaning that's a little bit nebulous between the two, or it means other things. But I consulted translations, and if you don't know languages, just consulting translations can help you out of it. Because if translations generally agree on something, then you can see that somebody might be trying to make a debate where one doesn't exist quite as much. I looked at, I don't know how many translations. Most of them say for our transgressions. A couple I found, two in particular, said he was pierced because of our transgressions. The NET the Net Bible, and the HCSB, the Holman Christian Standard, which I imagine the Christian Standard, which is the same version really, says the same thing. But there's a bunch that says he was pierced for our transgressions. I'll give you a big list right now. The ESV, the New King James, the NIV, the NASB, the NRSV, the King James Version, the Lexham English Bible, the NCV, the RSV, the ASV, the GNT, the 1890 Darby Bible, the Young's Literal Translation, Dewey Reeves Bible, and the Wycliffe Bible. And they all agree for our transgressions. I don't think that they're all, being influenced by theological bias. Certainly not the New Revised Standard Version, which seems like it translates anything in a liberal way whenever it possibly can, if you ask me. But even if they were right, if it's because of, it still doesn't rule out PSA. It just doesn't. Yeah.
It sure as heck doesn't prove it. Also, he'll do this where also he rattles off a bunch of references or a bunch of like things like that, or like translations. And I think people kind of get duped into being like, oh, so that must mean that this is super backed up and really well researched. It's really easy to throw out proof texts. Like, even though I put like a bunch of in my book, I put parentheses, like certain passages, like a little reference here, a little reference there. Like, I almost hesitated even doing that because it's so easy to just like shove that in there and then just assume your interpretation of that particular passage. So I don't know if some people buy into that, but I wanted to point out what Neville said here, because Isaiah 53 in the King James does a really good job at kind of driving home what I was talking about in this area of like how peace and chastisement can kind of work. So right here, but he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. See the difference? It's not him receiving like punishment from God, but the chastisement of our peace. So in the King James, it renders it this way, which goes back into what I was saying, that as the people beat him, it actually was the thing that was going to bring them peace, and they did not know it because they were so filled with hatred. So anyway, hope that brings some sort of clarification to somebody. I don't know.
But this will be a huge debate point. And I think that when you're nitpicking things that don't even make your case, it's evidence that your case is weak sauce, right? That's what you need to learn from this. When they nitpick this phrase 4 hour, he was crushed 4 hour because of, you're just learning how weak their case is against penal substitution in this passage.
Brotato chip. Now you're so far, this has been one of the weakest presentations of penal substitution. Like, it makes me want to like almost step aside and go, no, here, let me help you. No, when people are pointed to because of, it's not because they're weak sauce. It's because they are trying to show a clarification word that could help people understand it from a different angle. You probably do the same thing, by the way, because you're not a Calvinist. You've discussed Calvinism before, and you'll go to Romans 9. You'll probably bring up, well, this word can kind of mean this, and kind of is this is what elect means, and doesn't it mean election to salvation? It can mean election to a vocation, or blah blah blah, messianic line. Insert thing here. Same with Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, like in his Jehovah's Witness series. Like, come on, man. Like, this is just no. This has been weak. All right, this is not good exegesis. This is just like asserting your stuff, saying a few things just because you think that you pointed out that transgressions are sins somehow means PSA doesn't get you anywhere. We all know transgressions equals sins. So there is no debate on that. Again, this isn't good. This isn't good work. Mike, I know you can do better than this. And I love you. And I'm saying this as a brother. Like, it's one of those things where, in fact, okay. So Dr. Jonathan Pritchett came over to my house this last weekend and helped me rip out my floors, and it was a bear of a job because we had some stuff. And we were joking around, and I was like, and I just told him, because we got our butts kicked. I was like, man, I'm never going to pass my master's thesis with you grading it now, am I? Because I made him do this. And I was like, look, dude, I was like, as my friend, can I just put one little footnote at the bottom and you just pass me, just joke around. And he goes, well, you know what the rule is with this? Our names go on those. I have to sign off on that, which means I have to be extra hard on that. So he'd be extra hard on me. He's like, I'll be extra hard on you because we're friends, right? He's like, so that way you're not getting favoritism. As a friend, actually, I would expect him to. I'd expect him to be like, dude, if I turned in shoddy work for a thesis, I'd expect him to sit down and go, that was bad work, do better. Okay. Because you know what? That's what this is. this is bad work. Do better. Growing up, I took violin lessons. Okay. And I had a teacher of mine that she was an old lady that was brutal. Fun story with Pastor Will real fast. Okay. One day, so I was in all the music stuff. I was like a theater kid at Orc Dork. Okay. I played violin there. And, I had like a 3-day show that I had to do with choir, and I was playing violin in it, singing in it. I was doing all the things in it, doing a lot of instruments in it. And so I had dress rehearsal, then 3 days of shows. And I showed up to my private lessons for violin, and my teacher, I played literally 2 measures of Vivaldi's Concerto in A minor. And she goes, stop. How much did you practice this week? And I was like, well, I mean, I was pretty busy. We had cabaret. We had, she's like, no. How much did you practice? I'm not asking if you're busy. I'm asking, did you practice? I was like, probably not that much. She's like, yeah, I could tell, because that A is not as sharp as it should be. And don't you ever show up to my studio again and waste my time if you're not even going to practice. And don't waste your parents' money either. And she like laid into me. And then she's like, and if you're not going to show up and you're not going to practice, if you're not going to show up practiced, and you're not going to go home and practice, you may as well put down your basketball like all the other boys. No, you should put down your violin and pick up your basketball like all the other boys. Of course, I didn't know if she was at that point insulting other boys for playing basketball or insulting me for playing violin. But at that point, I was also too scared to ask. And my point of that is saying, sometimes if somebody loves you, they got to tell you when you're doing bad work. And that's sometimes the most loving thing you can do. So this is bad.
There's a lot of sin-bearing words in Isaiah 53 in particular. And here's the first one we get in verse 6. It says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now, here's where you've got to remember Isaiah is part of the Bible, the Old Testament. Isaiah comes and he's living in the Levitical sacrificial system and times, and they think through those concepts, and they interpret Jesus's sacrifice, where we should interpret Jesus' sacrifice through those concepts. And here's one of those concepts you might miss as perhaps a Westerner or someone who just doesn't maybe look carefully at the Old Testament law. That phrase, laid on him the iniquity of us all, that's a sin-bearing phrase. Sin-bearing phrase. And there's sin-bearing words in Isaiah. Here in Isaiah 53 verse 6, and then we also have one in Isaiah 53:11. Out of his the anguish of his soul, he'll see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be counted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. And then again in verse 12, let me find the spot. Here we go. Because he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. So this is sin-bearing language 3 times, and this is terminology from the Levitical law. Let's look at some of those passages. I want to show you how this phrase, sin-bearing, or laid the sin upon him, this is huge for understanding what Isaiah is talking about and how it's a sacrificial death that
this is going to be such a monumental fail.
In Leviticus 5:1, we read this. This is what sin-bearing means in the mind of the Israelite, in the mind of Isaiah as he's writing this. If anyone sins, in that he hears a public adoration to testify, and though he is a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet does not speak, he shall bear his iniquity. What does that mean? It means he's guilty. Like, he's going to be in a state of guilt before God, and legally, this is the context in Leviticus, and specifically, there's like a juridical or legal guilt that the man faces in the eyes of the law, the Levitical law, because he did that. Another passage is in Leviticus 7:18. Okay, so they eat the flesh of the sacrifice of the peace offering. They eat it on the wrong day, and they violated the rules for how that sin offering is to be treated. And it says, and he who eats of it shall bear his iniquity. Okay, so again, we have someone who violates the law of the Old Testament. Now they're bearing iniquity, and now they have guilt upon them. And this thing's going to be dealt with either through punishment or through sacrifice. That's generally the general rule or idea we get. In Leviticus 24:15, we get sin bearing again. Notice it's usually people bear their own iniquity, the typical way of things happening, right? And speak to the people of Israel, saying, whoever curses his God shall bear his sin. You will stand in a guilty position before God, bearing sin. You're carrying guilt is the idea. You're going to carry guilt, and then that changes everything in your life. Finally, Leviticus 10:17. This is going to be a different passage, because this is where Leviticus talks about somebody else bearing iniquity. Not his own iniquity, but bearing somebody else's iniquity. Leviticus 10:17. God speaking to the high priest, he says, why have you not eaten the sin offering in the place of the sanctuary, since it is the thing most holy and has been given to you, that you may bear the iniquity of the congregation? Why? To make atonement for them before the Lord. Wait, when I bear iniquity, I'm guilty, but when some substitute bears iniquity, my iniquity, our iniquity, it's going to atone for us that we might be forgiven. That's the context of Isaiah 53. This is so clearly penal substitution and atonement. This is Seems like it to me.
Oh, really, Mike? Is that what it is? So let's jump in here real fast. Okay. Isaiah 53. So, and we will, I love verse 6. We like sheep have gone astray. So now, okay, first off, let's go back where it says, upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. Or remember the peace, the chastisement that brought us peace, essentially, or the idea that, I forgot, man, it's slipping my brain all of a sudden. Anyway, the chastisement that brought us peace. The chastisement that was on Jesus is ultimately what brought peace. The people punishing him actually was what brought them peace. That's the plot twist. And with his wounds, we are what? Healed. Okay, so it's restorative language. He seems to ignore this, by the way, quite a bit. All we like sheep have what? Gone astray. So now they're wandering. We have turned everyone to his own way. Okay, so kind of even the idea of judges here a little bit. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And we have all done what we want. Now, what's happening here? What's happening here? Well, you have to go back up. What is he here? This is in the same paragraph section of verse 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken by God. We considered him to be stricken by God and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like has we have gone astray, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Do you not see the parallelism here? You can go into verse 6 and see that the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all is all right up here with he has carried our griefs and our sorrows. And then we see the considered him to be part as in direct connection to the idea of everyone going their own way. Everyone going their own way is directly connected to this idea of considering him. So you're not really there, dude. You're just not getting with the poetry. That's all. That's my simple assessment here. However, let's actually get into this a little bit further. So remember this idea of bearing. He takes that as always sin bearing language. Now, what bearing means in Hebrew is also this idea of like lifted up. So it's like to lift up or to come alongside. So he will bear his own sin. It's like, yeah, he's going to be the one who lifts up his own sin. Essentially, it's going to be his burden to carry. So it's not this idea of imputation, because guess what? Well, if you get into Isaiah 53 and you get into real quick, let's just look at this. Verse 14 in Matthew. This is the Gospel of Matthew, reading that Septuagint that is unreliable of Isaiah 53. Remember, Isaiah 53 in the Septuagint is unreliable, according to Mike Ware. So we're undercutting Scripture in order to hold PSA, by the way. But it says this in Matthew 8:14. And when Jesus entered Peter's house and he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever, he touched her hand and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. So we have a healing here. And that evening, they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This was to what? Fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and he bore our diseases. What does bearing mean in Isaiah 53? To come alongside and restore. By his stripes we are healed. The chastisement that what? Brought us peace. These is continually restorative language, that despite the affliction, Christ is restoring. That despite your hurt and your brokenness, he brings you life. Right here we see it. Otherwise, is this diseases being imputed to Christ? Was it some sort of superpower where he like sucked the sickness, the cancer out of one person and gave it to himself? No, it's not imputation. It's restorative. He came alongside, bore them up. Same idea. So keep that in mind when this is being brought up, that according to Mike, the Septuagint's rendering of Isaiah 53 is unreliable. And apparently Matthew is using the unreliable version because he's quoting Septuagint. And 3, that bearing is sin-bearing language, even though it's the same kind of language that's used to talk about the healing. And it makes sense, by the way. You know, if somebody came alongside you and walked with you through difficulty and strife. And whether, like, let's say you were in poverty and you're struggling to pay your bills, and some rich dude who's a good loving guy comes alongside you, and he walks in and he gives you the money. He starts repairing your house or your broken fridge, like I might have right now. And, he starts giving you all those things, and he comes alongside you and he bears that burden with you to restore you. Now, the reason why in the other places that it's like they will bear their own iniquities is because there's no one there coming alongside to restore them. They will have to bring restoration themselves, or suffer the consequences if they don't repent and do that which is correct according to the actual Levitical system. Because the Levitical system actually had a system on how you would bear that burden for restoration. That's the whole point of those sacrifices, was restorative, to give that gift to God and bring that fellowship back again and share a meal with your creator. So, yeah, sorry, Mr. Winger, but that doesn't quite go. Let's see. Amber, hello. By the way, I saw you were on a live stream when I hopped on mine, so I guess you're off your live stream. She goes, Matthew is the prophet's ninja. It's almost like Isaiah told that salvation includes healing. Exactly. Father Stephen DeYoung says, Jesus got that fever. That was a punishment from God on Peter's mother-in-law, as it is written. She who nags her daughter's husband shall fall by the flu. Did that just come to you that quickly? I'm concerned now. You might need therapy. In Truth by Grace says 100%. Matthew 8:17 literally confirms and interprets that LXS is Isaiah 50. LXS is 53:4. So that was that was what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. He himself took our weaknesses and carried our diseases. Sorry, I can't read right now. It's late. I'm going to wrap this up shortly here, and then we'll continue this video next week before Christmas.
Maybe I'm missing something here, but let me give you another one here. Leviticus 16:22. This is speaking of the Day of Atonement, which we got into in the last video in the series on penal substitution. We got
go to my video last week where I explained the Day of Atonement and how that doesn't work for penal substitution. Okay, I'm not going to break all that down in this one.
The huge details on the Day of Atonement and all that, but it says that the goat shall bear the iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he'll let the goat go free in the wilderness. This goat was the priest would touch the goat, push his hands on him, and confess the sins of Israel on the goat, and then send the goat out. And then the symbolism is he's the sin-bearing goat. Sin is being taken away. That's the idea. And so the sacrifice
So it's symbolism. You admit it's symbolism. The idea is that they're casting sin out of Eden, out of Israel, out of God's presence that belongs, and it says it to Azazel, the king of the demons. He sends out to the wilderness, the scary place, the evil place. That's where it belongs. That's the picture.
Isaiah 53 is a substitutionary individual who's going to bear the sins, and he'll be called a sacrifice later, so I'm not just importing that idea. It's in the passage. Who's bearing the sins of the people so that they can be forgiven. They think he's being punished for his own sin, but in reality, now that you see the contrast, Isaiah 53 shows us he's being punished for their sins. He's suffering for the sins they committed.
Yeah. Okay, so they think he's being punished for his own sin. Like, yeah, he deserves this. But really, they realize it's for their own sin. Right. They realize that they're wrong. They realize it's wrong to kill the servant, that they actually are killing the Messiah. Like, they realize their sin and he's dying to heal them. Like, it's just funny because it's just, there's so much claims of like so much research, and then seems like it's like forest for trees, just mist. And, and I normally I have this conversation all the time because nobody in the Protestant evangelical world basically denies PSA. And so I have these conversations pretty regularly with people, like often. And generally speaking, it turns into like, just question asking clarifications. And it turns out to be a lot of fun. But when you have somebody present themselves to be some sort of expert to make like such like audacious claims and dismissive statements and assertions, it's just like, well, I don't know how much of an expert you are in this field because whoosh, yeah.
So this rules out the idea that he bore our sins in the sense that we sinned against him, or like Brian Zahn likes to say, we violently sinned our sins into Jesus, and to him that's the whole story. He then denies that Christ actually suffered a punishment that we deserved. That part is denied. But rather with the Old Testament, you see there's this idea of guilt. When you sin, guilt is upon you, you're bearing it. But when there's a substitute who bears your guilt for you, you can be atoned for, you can be forgiven, and that is the role of the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. Yeah. Okay, verse 7. Let's read on. He was oppressed. There it is. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Now, this is the implication is that Jesus, what would happen to Jesus was unjust. And this is where the anti-PSA guys will agree. They'll be like, yes, Mike, yes, finally you're hearing me, Mike. Verse 7, it was wrong. He was oppressed. It was wrong. Verse 8 is going to support this too. By oppression and judgment, he was taken away. The idea here is that
notice this, by the way, by oppression and judgment, verse 8. Now, when judgment was randomly mentioned in Exodus, Mike was like, oh, that's judgment against Israel and Egypt, right? Because it just, when judgment's mentioned, it's got to be applied to everybody. Suddenly right here, he's gonna like shimmy and be like, oh yeah, it's oppression and judgment for the people. It's wrong from the people, but it's still God. You're gonna see this weird double down here, where it's like the way he applied judgment here to be a whole swath of things. Then here he's like, oh no, it's got to be this, but I'm also going to double down there. You're gonna notice this. What I'm saying here is that you're going to notice an inconsistent hermeneutic between how he applied the term judgment to Israel and Egypt to how he's going to apply it here.
it was unjust what happened to this suffering servant. And I agree with that. He didn't deserve it. But does that mean that it's not a judicial, penal, substitutionary kind of thing that's happening here? No, I think what it means, if you look at all of Isaiah 53 and you don't just hijack one phrase from one verse, it means that in respect to what Jesus deserved, it was unjust. In respect to what we deserved, it was just. He didn't die for his sins. He did it for our sins.
How is it just? How is that just? How's that just for us even? How's it just for us to punish somebody else when God makes very clear that it's actually the unjust thing, and he denies actual penal substitutes consistently throughout the Torah and the Tanakh. And then he also rejects the idea of punishing someone in the place of another outright in Ezekiel 18, straight up. So it can't be just toward us because it's not just to God. So it can't be just to us.
He wasn't bearing his own iniquity. He was bearing our iniquity. He was oppressed and he went into judgment, yet he did so because we deserve that. He went in my place. He suffered for me. That's the full context of Isaiah 53. So we need to take all of the truth and not hijack any out of context.
You're the one hijacking these. This is all clearly oppression language. He's being oppressed. These people are looking and they can't believe it. And he's healing them. It's like we see there's multiple facets going on. What's funny here is he's like, not just pulling out the one thing, a single passage can talk about multiple things at once. It can talk about the sin of oppression. It could talk about the healing of the people. It can talk about chastisement. It can talk about a lot of concepts and how they are all intertwining with each other in a particular narrative. And that's exactly what we see here. Not just penal substitution. Even if you read this as penal substitution, it's not the only thing going on in this text. There's clearly restorative language and other things. So it seems like he's just trying to cudgel his opposition here and dismiss them. And then if you start emphasizing a certain part of the passage, he's going to claim that you're ripping out one part of it. Even though you're like, no, I'm trying to say that this part is a key to understanding the rest of the text. And we do that all the time. But suddenly Isaiah 53 can't do that.
Context. Yeah, because let's see, how is it just? I'll give you an example. Hebrews 9:22. How is it just? How is there some sense of justice in this? Hebrews 9:22. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. There's something about the law, the justice, that says to us, yeah, there isn't going to be any forgiveness unless there is an offering.
Yes, and in the Levitical system, that shedding of blood was a purification rite. That's all it was. I've mentioned this before. Life equals death. I mean, blood equaled life. Life equaled purifying of death, or covenant life pledge to another person. Hence why under the law, almost everything is purified. It's expiatory language. It's purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. By the way, of sins is not in verse 22 in the Greek at all. So it's really shedding of blood. There is no forgiveness. And what a lot of people don't like to hear is that forgiveness is just releasing of debt language or purification language. That's like what the word literally means, like purifying or releasing of a debt. So without shedding of blood, there is no release of the debt, or there is no cleansing. Why? Well, because you haven't accepted the covenant. You're not in the covenants. You're not blood pledged for blood, life pledged for life. Your sin is not covered by life. Your sin is still stanky. It is still gross. It's still wrong. Okay, that's the whole point here. So anyway, I love when people go to Hebrews 9:22 because I'm like, I don't think it makes the case that you think it makes, but this really goes to show. Actually, I think that PSA advocates either have such a really like narrow understanding of the actual issues at hand, or they're just like exegetically obtuse. I have no idea which one it is, but anyway.
And so Christ, he is the offering to bring us forgiveness. So it's just like the animal sacrifices. The animals didn't deserve to die. No one would look at the animal and be like, you deserve what's about to happen to you. No, the idea is that other people deserve suffering, and this animal will be offered. The life of the animal is offered instead of their suffering. And so that's where Jesus, even here in Isaiah 53, he's described as being like a lamb led to the slaughter, like a lamb led to the slaughter. Right there. Okay. So we're going to look now at verse 9. It says, verse 8. We'll just finish verse 8 here, and then I'll move.
Okay. He wants to finish verse 8, but I do not want to finish verse 8 right now. What I'm going to do real fast is, I think, and next time we'll start off here again. Okay. But what I think I want to do is I'm going to show you something else that is also not often talked about in this area. And I know if Amber is still watching this, she's going to love it. But here, you can't really see it from there. Well, I'm going to switch it to, there we go. All right. So welcome to my PDF. Yes, guys, you are getting a sneak peek of my book. This is actually in one of the chapters of my book. This is part of my manuscript here. So you can like go through here and do all the reading. But anyhow, I just wanted to show that this has been pretty known. So many people are familiar with the fact that there's different like rhetoric that's used in ancient civilizations. And, that's where we'll say something like, being polemical, that was part of ancient rhetoric, or someone to get a diatribe, what a diatribe would be in the Greek. But the Old Testament times, in the ancient Near East, there were other ways of doing rhetorical plays. And a lot of times with the prophets, there's a lot of drama with these things, because a lot of them were written to not just a warning of Israel, but they were written as like liturgies. So in other words, that one person would say something, the other people would respond, then he would speak and he would respond. If you've ever been to like a Catholic church or an Orthodox church, you'd be very familiar with how liturgy works. And so anyway, look at what this says here. This here is Isaiah 53, but properly structured, because what Isaiah 53 is, and you can actually see it if you're paying close attention in English, but it's very clear in the Hebrew that there's two voices going on. There is the prophet speaking and then a crowd speaking. And so let me go ahead and read this to you. The prophet. So the prophet speaking. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised. And we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Then the crowd responds, yet we esteemed him stricken by God, smitten by God, and afflicted. And the prophet goes on in response to the crowd and says, but he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities, and upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. And all we like sheep have gone astray, and we have all turned everyone to his own way. So again, he's pleading with them, saying, guys, you did that, like, this is wrong. And the crowd goes, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted. And the prophet says, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth. And then the crowd responds, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. And yet, as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made him his grave with the wicked. And the prophet said, and yet was a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence. There was no deceit found in his mouth. And the crowd responds, yet it was the will of God to crush him, and he has put him to grief. And the prophet says, when his soul makes an offering for guilt, by the way, that's a cleansing offering. We get that kind of mixed up on what that it meant. Again, I think my previous video I talk about the offerings a little bit more. I also have a whole chapter on it, but the guilt offering is a purification offering. It doesn't mean a certain party is a guilty party. Okay. So when his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. Because he's not satisfied his wrath. He's satisfied at a job complete, y'all. Okay, so don't get excited. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. What? So he poured out his soul to death. So he went into Hades. He went to death, Sheol, the place of the dead, and was numbered among the transgressors because he was where dead people were, which is where sinners are. He was numbered among them. It doesn't mean like he actually was like counted as a sinner or punished. Yet he bore the sin of many. Like he took on their burden, right? He came alongside them and makes intercession for the transgressors. So bearing sin here means that he came alongside them. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for them. That's what it means to bear. Now, I explain here a little bit more of the Greek and not the Greek. Yeah, the Greek and the Hebrew, I suppose. But anyway, yeah, that's just a sneak peek in the book. You can pick it up on Amazon. But anyway, so Amber goes, Will, you got something right in Hebrew. Wow, I'm so proud. Thanks, Amber. I do try my best. So the point is here, is if you actually look at it, there's a dialogue going on, and the crowd has the wrong view. They're like, it's God. Yeah, God did this. Like they're kind of arguing with the prophet. The prophet's like, hello, this is what's going on. So you can get this idea here that Mike and others really got Isaiah 53 wrong. And I'm not sure if it's completely their fault, because I think our culture has just shifted to that so much, but it is your fault when there's willful blindness and like when you're led to the water and you refuse to drink, or when you just are so, you scoff at people who go, I think we got this wrong. So anyway, right, exactly. Johnny F says, numbered among the transgressors was quoted by Luke when Jesus was arrested for supposedly inciting a violent coup. Exactly. So he was counted, numbered among them, but he actually didn't do anything wrong. Like that's the whole point. Like it was a faux trial. It was all rigged. It was all bad. And none of it was like, it wasn't good, but God knew that that's what the people would do. And he used that to undo all the sin. That's the powerful part. He did it for our sins to heal us. So, the church fathers could say whatever they want. The fact remains there would not be a Hebrew text in common circulation among the Christians until the 11th century AD. God meant to do that. And the thing is like, that's why they use Septuagint, man. Like, but according to Mike, you can't trust it. So, again, just because I am saying Mike is a very, 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 very wrong doesn't mean I don't like Mike. It doesn't mean I don't love Mike. Just means that Mike is very, 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 very wrong. Much like how your Aunt Linda at Thanksgiving is mostly wrong about all her politics. And then she's also terrified that the rapture is going to happen tomorrow. And it's all wrong, but you love her anyhow, even though she's very, very, very wrong. Same thing can be done here. But, not all of you should become teachers because you'll be judged with greater strictness. And trust me, when I say that right there burns into my brain all the time. So, yeah, guys, this is going to be, I'm just going to wrap up this stream right now. If you have any questions or whatever, put them in the comments below and share this along. Give it a like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. It does help. And of course, if you want to support me on Patreon, all of that helps because nothing's free anymore. But honestly, I'd much rather anyone pick up my book and leave me a 5-star review on Amazon, because that does help. It is continually actually in the top 100 books in like the systematic theology and Christology sections and historical theology, which is pretty cool. I did not expect that to be a thing, but I definitely would prefer getting that into more people's hands, just because I think sometimes my personality, I get very excited. I'm also very pointed in my disagreement, and I think some of that can be a little distracting for people. And I wish I could turn that part of me off, but it is my personality, and I am who I am. But the book reads differently. The book reads the way I teach, which is different than the way I stream, I suppose. I don't know. It's weird. I guess when I'm streaming, I'm vibing, and so it just happens. But when I'm teaching, I'm like, I've suddenly become a professional. You answer your DM. What DM? Amber, you ask a lot of me. I hope you know that. You have a friend with an OT channel with an awesome video about Leviticus. Is that a shameless plug right now, Amber? Really? Actually, I'm glad you brought it up. I actually meant to tell people about that because I watched it earlier. Yes, she's got a great book on why Leviticus a great video on why Leviticus matters. And she has some great guys. Another guy you need to check out, actually, thanks for mentioning this, Amber, is Leviticus is Fun. Phil there, he's Australian, and he's also really funny. He's funny, but he's a butcher. So he actually like knows what he's doing when he's like cutting up meats and stuff. So he actually reads Leviticus going, oh, well, duh. I get the symbolism here so much clearer, because he actually does that sort of thing. So the really cool channel, very small channel, but he deserves to be larger than what he is, and so does Amber. But Amber, I know, just started her little YouTube career here, and she's good people. So we want to make sure we keep fostering good community. So what are your thoughts on the scapegoat Rene Girard theory of the atonement? I wouldn't say I hold to the scapegoat theory as far as the atonement model. I wouldn't say like, yeah, that's mine. I hold to recapitulation, Christus Victor, ransom, like augmented ransom, and moral example. But I don't hate it. The problem is with it is I think like similar to like the governmental view of atonement, is I think it emphasizes a little bit too much of like liberation, and some of the like. I think it just emphasizes some things a little too strongly, but I don't hate it. I actually think it has plenty of good points. So anyway, It's Truth by Grace says, brother, you are doing a great job on this. Thank you so much. This is very good. I'll get myself your book for Christmas. Your passion is shared by many. Thanks, man. I'm glad somebody gets it. Like I mean, I'll get comments regularly. Like, dude, I'm trying to hang with you, but like you're just so like intense as a person, like not always like yelling, just like high energy. This is why I'm a youth pastor, y'all. Like, so it's the only language they understand, and I bring that like energy here. Actually, I don't. It's not that. It's the personality. But I appreciate it, guys. And that's actually one thing I do want to say. I was thinking this earlier today. I appreciate every single one of you who watches these videos. These are not short videos, they're long videos. There's a lot of pausing, talking. I know it's a lot. It can be maybe grind you a little bit. But anyone who sticks to the very end of these, like, thank you. It's helpful for me. Everyone who likes and shares all those things, subscribes, comments, all that really helps. And this is becoming actually a thing for my wife and I, where it's like actually becoming side income that's actually noticeable. And I'm hoping that that trend can continue, because I would love for my wife not to have to work part-time at all. I would like her just to be able to sit out and me to do this thing. But I just really appreciate you guys helping me out with this, like, and supporting the channel. And, you know, if ever I'm wrong, though, I do expect you guys to correct me in the comments and make me look a fool, because sometimes that needs to happen. Anyhow, guys, I hope I look forward to seeing you next week when I do my next stream. Look forward to more videos coming to you. And after Christmas, I'm going to be starting, when I'm done with all this, Theology of the Body is coming at you. I know it's supposed to be done in the fall, but whatever. Here we are. But anyhow. All right. Take care, guys. God bless. We'll see you in the next one. Oh, I'm just going to get rid of that. Now we'll see you in the next one. Bye.